Okay. Hey, hi, this is Dr. Bob Evans, and this is our first video podcast, which we call Parental Alienation from the Couch to the Courtroom and Beyond. And today we have Dr. Michael Bone with us again. We had an audio presentation previously. I think that was episode 32. This would be considered episode 33. Although I apologize to people who are watching us video-wise, this will be our first video podcast. So
Right.
anyway, we're talking today about different roles that professionals have in these parental alienation cases. And today we want to talk about the guardian ad litem, and then possibly, if we have time, we might talk about child's counsel or the attorney for the child that seems to be cropping up more and more in some of these cases.
Yeah. Yes.
So, Mike, we want to talk a little bit about the implications of parental alienation and the role of a guardian ad litem. It seems like,
One, yeah, I think one of the things that's the most important to understand is that, and depending on the jurisdiction, most guardians ad litem really don't have a lot of psychological training in their background. They're either attorneys or they're volunteers or something like that. So when their job is to basically they're sent in by the court because they're appointed by the court to basically investigate what's going on and then report back to the court with specific recommendations. So in the case of alienation, what does that mean? It means that they're going to go first of all to where the children are primarily. So if you have an alienation case where there's one parent who has not really been seeing the children for whatever reason because there's a allegation of something in a protective order, whatever. Uh, as a consequence, the guardian is going to go where the children are with the alienating parent. So the chances of them becoming biased is extraordinarily high. I mean, Richard Gardner had made the statement that he felt that guardians got these cases wrong about 95% of the time. That is, these cases meaning alienation cases. And it makes sense. I mean, in comes the guardian who's supposed to be concerned with the best interest of the child. They hear that parent, then they meet with the child, and they're hearing the same thing over and over. And as we know, in an alienated kind of environment, they're all going to be in sort of in lockstep with each other. So now if there are two children, now you got three voices saying the same thing. That's pretty convincing.
well, and one of the things too, Mike, it doesn't necessarily have to have a protective order in place. You
Right.
could have an alienating parent doing what alienating parents do. They sequester the child away from the other parent.
Exactly.
So um, sometimes I heard this many times in court that they may not know why the child's not seeing the other parent, but there must be a good reason. And
Right.
guardians are susceptible to the same misinformation as other people involved in these cases, the judge, the child's attorney, the evaluator, the therapists that are involved. And so the guardian can also get it wrong. Well, one of the things that we know about, we got this information primarily from Dr. Stephen Miller, is some of the misconceptions or these cases appear very counterintuitively in the
Yeah.
sense that what we're seeing doesn't necessarily mean what we think it means. And so, the rejected parent, for example, very frequently is feeling very afraid, very anxious, agitated. They get upset. Why? Because they're not seeing the parent. The parent's not seeing the child.
Right.
So
But they've been traumatized. Absolutely.
and we got the favored parent or the alienating parent who appears very, very calm, very convincing, very charming, okay, very
Uh,
cool. This
Yep.
they're not. There's a significant difference in their behaviors of the targeted parent versus the favored parent, and that gets misinterpreted.
Yes. Absolutely. I think the targeted parent it really has been traumatized, and they've been probably falsely accused of all kinds of things. They're always defending them, or they're defending themselves rather constantly. So I mean, that's what the guardian will sort of drop into in
Right.
the midst of this. And if they don't realize that's what's going on, they're very likely to get it not just a little bit wrong, but backwards.
Well, and I think, did you say traumatized that they haven't seen their child?
Yeah.
Okay, and they don't understand why they're not seeing the child. And depending on the severity of the alienation, if the child's telling them, "Hey, I never want to see you again. I wish you were dead," And this is new data to this parent of saying like, how did we get here? You know,
Right.
and the allegations that the child will levy against that parent, given the severity of the alienation, will be things like the parent will say, "Well, that never happened. I don't understand what they're talking about."
Exactly.
So,
Exactly. Also, and we'll address this in other places, but just a quick mention here that we understand that there's a high incidence of certain personality disorders that we see in more severely alienating parents, and that's going to play into this pretty significantly, and we'll certainly be able to talk about that further in other contexts. And that's a big deal. That's a
in,
big,
in all likelihood, untreated. So
right.
the alienation, the pathological personality is untethered in every sense of the word. And I think one of the things that what the guardian is going to see is a child who appears to be very bonded to one parent
Yes.
and very, let's say, detached, if you will, from the targeted parent. And that bonding is misinterpreted as being, well, look at how what a loving, close relationship they have, not understanding the pathological basis or the dynamics of the pathology of that enmeshed relationship.
Exactly. I mean, healthy parenting really stresses, healthy boundaries. It stresses independence, exploration into the world, all those positive things. Whereas this is the opposite. This really is where the alienated child sort of operates in lockstep with the alienating parent, and they're penalized if they don't. So
Right.
there's a guardian walking into this highly kind of biased kind of environment. And unless they really understand and know to critique any allegations, that they're very likely to get it wrong. And
And
then
or
that,
investigate. They need
yeah,
to get past the counterintuitiveness of what they're looking at.
yeah,
It just doesn't make any sense to them. And one of the distinctions too that we learned the difference between parental alienation syndrome and parental alienation is the child's participation in the syndrome
right.
is what Gardner would focus on. And Gardner would say that actually the favorite parent or the alienating parent would essentially fall to the background, and the child would then pick up the cause. And the child would then become very assertive and aggressive in expressing the hatred and the dislike of the targeted parent. That's parental alienation syndrome in action.
Yes, exactly. And that's very persuasive. I mean, again, if you have eh, they're all saying the same thing, and
Right,
they're all
right,
speaking negatively about the other parent who the child says they don't want to see, and that parent is again, as we've been traumatized. And
right.
oh, the thing I meant to mention when I brought up the personality disorder thing is that I mean, with personality disorders, the ones that we see very often in these cases, there's no insight into that whatsoever, no understanding of their contribution to the problem. So as a consequence, they interpret other people's behavior and assign meaning to it that it may not have, and they reason more by emotion than by logic. So you can't talk them out of a misinterpretation of something. They really tend to believe the distortions. And again, that's all part of that personality
Exactly.
disorder thing that we see.
Exactly, exactly. Again, when we get these severe cases, what you're going to find is allegations of abuse levied towards a targeted parent. Okay. And again, this becomes kind of a distinguishing characteristic in these cases, in that the child is claiming that they were abused and or supported by the favored parent, suggesting that the child was abused, the child was neglected by the targeted parent. Well, that again, that's counterintuitive because if the child was actually abused by that parent, the research tells us that the child would want to maintain that relationship. So abused children want to maintain a relationship with the perpetrator of the abuse. That happens all the time.
Yes.
In dependency court, the kids do not want to be separated from that parent, even though that parent was neglectful and abusive, etc.
Well,
Alienated children don't want any part of the alleged perpetrator of abuse, which is, again, the opposite of what we know in these cases.
right, exactly. Yeah. I mean, that's it's predictable and shocking at the same time, which is kind of a unusual combination. But the personality disorder thing is a big a big deal because they do really believe they're distortions, and that makes them very persuasive, doesn't it? So again, we have a guardian walking into all this, and there's all these dynamics going on, and and there's a lot of pressure. I mean, when children are alienated, the fuel that drives alienated behavior is fear of displeasing the alienating
Right,
parent. So
right,
they're in comes the guardian walking in on this and not realizing what they're seeing, and the child really wants to be in lockstep with that alienating parent. But and again, if the guardian doesn't understand the dynamics of what's going on, they're very likely to get it not just wrong, but backwards.
right, right. And one of the things I don't think guardians, maybe a mental health professional who's appointed as a guardian might do this more often than not, they don't. And that is do a very deep dive into the parent's childhood and background.
Yep.
Because
Yep.
what we find is that there's usually that kind of trauma that exists in the favored parent's background that has never really been resolved. They've been rejected. They've been alienated. Some major trauma has occurred in that person's life frequently. And it's not saying every single case. And that trauma is getting played out today with that case in the alienation case, so that they're reliving that history. In other words, as an example, it's very frequent that a parent has had no contact with their one of their parents. I don't want to give a
Yeah.
gender to it. Okay. So one of their parents left them when they were very young or when some point in their lives, when during a very high conflict divorce. And what's happening today is that parent is very comfortable with the idea that the child will not have contact with that other parent. And
In other words, based on their own childhood experiences, their template of what a nuclear family is may not include the other parent, and
well,
that's just normal for them.
I give this testimony a lot in court where basically when as a child you're looking at your mother and your mother becomes a model for what it's like to be a woman, a mother, and a wife. You look at your father and your father becomes a model for what it's like to become a father, a husband, and a man. And those roles become virtually indelible in terms of the child's mind and model, in terms of how do you what you grow up with, what it's like, how do you become a parent? And that's how
Yeah.
you become a parent. So I parent as I was parented. Oh, there are some exceptions in the sense that, well, if I was really severely abused as a child, I'm going to not do that as an adult, people will say. But that abuse that you experienced as a child really affects how you function today as an adult.
And as a child, if you experienced alienation, you don't think of it that way. You don't think of it as trauma. You think of it as reality.
Right.
And so they're again no insight at all.
I don't know how many, I mean, I've done hundreds of child custody evaluations, and I'll get a description of the alienating parent's childhood from that parent, from that alienating parent, and they'll tell me, "Oh, my childhood was idyllic. I just had a wonderful relationship.
Yes, yes.
With my mother was my best friend, and it was just terrific." And you find out that well, mother was abused in front of the child. The mother was abandoned by the other parent,
Right.
or the other way around, or the mother left, whatever. And it's just, again, a contradiction to what's going on in that person's life.
And that raises a really important point. I mean, just in a general sense, I mean, what's really required in these cases, not to get them wrong or backwards, there really needs to be a investigation into what really has happened. And
Yes.
that very often doesn't happen with guardians ad litem.
No.
They just sort of accept whatever the status quo and assume it's always been that way, which is, in an alienation case, is the opposite of that. Something bad, there's a tremendous degradation in the relationship between the child and the targeted parent.
Exactly.
So, yeah,
Yeah. So one of the other things that we know, and it's generally accepted within, I think proponents of the alienation dynamic is that parental alienation is child abuse.
Yes,
Okay. And so
absolutely.
that's a really important piece for guardians, evaluators, judges, lawyers, child attorneys need to understand that this is child abuse.
And that's another example of how abused children, they Amy Baker wrote a book called Bonded to the Abuser. And basically, when abused children, they are bonded to their abusive parent. And if parental alienation is child abuse, which it is, then of course that's another way to understand the connection they have with that alienating parent is because the boundaries between them have been obliterated. They're enmeshed now.
Exactly. And the reason there's substantial proof, if you will, in terms of different organizations, the American Association of Parent Alienation, excuse me, APSAC is the American Society of Professionals on Child Abuse.
Right.
Okay.
I never can remember that one either.
They they define what child maltreatment is. Child maltreatment is accepted by the Center for Disease Control as a form of abuse for children. So the Center for Disease Control outlines the same thing that ABSAC does in terms of what behaviors constitute child abuse. Step in the dynamics of parental alienation, and those behaviors, the 17 strategies we talk about in terms of what an alienating parent does, those strategies conform to the ABSAC and CDC rules. So
Yes.
uh, A
It's not
equals
just a theory.
no,
It's
A
accepted.
equals B, A equals B, B equals C, therefore A equals C. So in
Right.
other words, alienation equals child abuse.
Yes. Yes. But I think the investigating, that's the message I think is so important, be it for an evaluator, be it for a guardian or any role particularly, is there really needs to be a careful critique of why the child doesn't want to see that parent
Yes.
and not and they need to look at all hypotheses and not just one that is apparent to them as they walk in the front door.
Well, and so if you know, if you suspect that alienation is going on, then you've got to convince the court to stop the abuse.
Right.
Because this is what this is about. This isn't about flipping custody. This isn't about championing one parent over another parent. It's about protecting the child from being abused because of
Yeah.
the consequences. And these cases move through the system like molasses going uphill.
Yes.
So if there is alienation going on, there is abuse going on, that child's exposed in some cases to years.
Years. Yes.
And it's got to stop.
Yeah.
It has to be an understanding by the by courts, judges, attorneys, evaluators that this is something that needs to be intervention. There needs to
Yeah. Yeah.
right. So
And that seems to be, I mean, again, the person in the courtroom by design that knows the least about the case is the judge because of the rules of evidence. They just can, it's like a filter that filters out stuff that is not considered of an evidentiary standard. So that means the judge is sitting up there going, okay, who do I believe? And
right,
it really is, it's so unless the court appoints someone that can actually critique what's going on, it's not going to be very helpful. And again, as we've said in different ways, the guardians are very likely to get it wrong and make it worse.
right. And
And
they're the ones
inside, yeah,
that courts listen to.
yeah, very often,
They have a
yes.
lot of power and control in a courtroom, in many cases.
Yes, yes. And when you get a guardian that really gets it backwards, which happens a lot, I mean, trying to get rid of a guardian and have them not be appointed, but it's very difficult.
It is.
I mean, I'm trying to remember if I can recall of any case specifically. I can't right now as I sit here, but uh, but it's uh, well, a serious problem.
It is an issue. And then I know we can very analogous to having the child's attorney involved. Again, the same kind of issue. Okay. There has to be an understanding, and there seems to be a void of information or understanding of the significance of children having both parents. Okay.
Yeah.
The research is so solid in terms of
Yes.
how children weather these divorce cases that and then not maybe it's a divorce or it's a separation between people that maybe haven't been married, but it's children need both parents.
Exactly.
That's a fact. That's solid
But
science.
I mean, exactly. And let's say you have a family that's getting, parents are getting divorced, and alienation is not going on. What we find is that those children, their main complaint is they want to see both their parents more.
Right,
I mean,
right,
that's one of the
exactly,
things that they will tell you.
right.
I wish I saw dad more or mom more, or so.
The idea of a child rejecting a parent is counter-instinctual in the sense that, as Dr. Miller would tell us, if that was a normal phenomenon where children were, it was acceptable that children could reject a parent, the human race would become extinct.
Right,
Okay,
we wouldn't be here.
no, because children would be off getting eaten by saber-toothed tigers, and that would be
Right,
the end of the whole thing. Okay.
exactly.
So, but the other thing that's troubling or concerning is that what courts don't understand about the phenomenon is that they then simply refer out to counseling. So we
Right,
take a severe alienation case and we're gonna send it to a counselor. Oh, we might change the name. We might call it reunification therapy.
right.
What needs to be understood is that there's no such thing as reunification therapy. It doesn't exist. It is not there's no school of thought of reunification therapy. Okay. Um, it's something that has been created by the court
Yes.
essentially to say, go to a counselor and get reunification therapy. Okay. And
And
so,
I think, and the court has a naive understanding of mental health things. They basically the court is very quick to throw counseling out there as here do I mean the court would rather move something an inch than a foot.
right,
And so
but repeatedly,
yeah,
in other words, we'll go through a period of time where the child would be seeing a therapist under the idea of getting reunified, and it's not working. It doesn't work. And so we'll get somehow or other the court gets convinced to get rid of that therapist and institute another therapist. And so they just keep doing the same thing.
yes.
Okay.
Now, one exception to this, and let's say you do have a therapist that understands alienation. Now, they can't, in their therapy context of seeing, doing quote unquote reunification therapy, which is problematic anyway. I mean, uh, the reunification, the therapist who it does understand alienation, they have an opportunity to number one, not make it worse
Right.
but also then potentially be able to report back to the court about why the therapy isn't working
Exactly.
because the source of the problem is not sitting in the room. It's out there at the other in the form of the other parent. So I often say that therapy for outpatient therapy for severe alienation is really more a tactical thing where the therapist says it's not working because the real problem is not here in the office. It's not the relationship of this child with this parent. It's the other parent's influence that's doing it.
Right. And in the meantime, of course, the child is residing with that favorite parent. And so they're
Yes.
still in this continuous influence of that parent. And the parent may appear to be cooperating with the court order and saying, well, they're providing the child to the therapy and they're moving in there. And the idea is that, well, okay, well, maybe the therapist needs to work with the favorite parent. But if the therapist isn't that familiar with personality disorders, with the phenomenon of alienation, they're going again, they can make the same mistakes that the guardians do in that, oh, this looks like a bonded, loving relationship. And that other for the child to dislike that other parent, that other parent must have done something. Okay. They had to have done something to cause this. Because children just don't do this on their own.
Right. Right.
Right. Well, you're right. Children don't do it on their own. They're being manipulated and influenced and programmed by somebody who's doing that. So we use the analogy of living in a cult. So if the child was
Yeah.
living in a cult and all we did was treat the child, but we allowed the child to continue to live in that cult, you're not going to save the
Well,
child
that's a great way to put it.
to
Yeah.
reject the cult. Well, he
Yeah.
said, well, and if we bring the cult leader into the therapy, think about that. How effective do you think that'll be?
Yeah.
Oh, we're going to convince now the cult leader to allow the child to have a relationship with other people. Well, you can't do that because the other people might manipulate the child against the cult leader. So they can't allow that.
Yeah. And so if the court has now appointed a guardian, and then there's a therapist, but that doesn't work. So there's another therapist, and there's another therapist. So you have all these failed therapy attempts, let's say, that have been recommended by the guardian. Very often happens is the targeted parent will often get blamed because they're sort of stuck in this position
Right.
of just repeating the false allegations all over again very often. And I see that you might have a therapist that sort of gets what's going on, but then the therapist gets affected by it and they become influenced by the alienating messages themselves. I mean, I've seen that happen. I'm sure you have too. I mean,
Well,
this is very powerful, persuasive stuff. It just is. And when you say, well, they don't want to see that parent because that parent has hurt them in the past or is abusive. That's a powerful message.
and as this process gets drawn out and the child gets older and more entrenched in the alienation process, the rejected parent gets more frustrated, more angry, more agitated, and in all likelihood, frequently will do and say things that wind up inappropriately, that then becomes evidence to support their dysfunctional relationship with the child, and therefore that validates the child's rejection. And
Exactly. I
and
mean, again, now you have a guardian in here who's seeing all this, and there's one parent that's not seeing their child, and they're upset about it, which is understandably. But now that reaction is now the reaction is, oh, that's why they don't want to see him. Look at the way they're acting. I mean, it just gets I mean, that's one way to understand. I think alienation in general is what alienating parents do is interpret events and tell the child what they mean. Oh, your father did this. Oh my gosh, and will convey it in those kinds of ways.
well, we could go through the 17 strategies. They'll be reminded of things that parent maybe have done when they were in college. Well, your
Yeah.
mother, your father smoked marijuana when they were in college, so therefore they're drug addicts. They really never stopped doing that, or they were alcoholics, or
Right.
they did crazy behaviors and stuff. And again, the idea that the therapy that is ordered repeatedly, not only doesn't it work, it usually makes it worse.
Yes.
Okay. And then you have the potential of the therapist becoming an advocate for the favored parent, supporting the child. Well, then under the guise of, well, we have to listen to the child. Okay.
Right.
The child has something to say in this whole matter. And I don't want to get into a soapbox, but we have laws in this country to protect children. And the
Right.
laws basically say that children can't go to work at a certain age. They can't join the army. They can't vote. They can't go in a bar. They can't do a whole lot of things as a form of protection for the child. But for some reason, they can reject a parent and that becomes acceptable. So that's
Yeah.
become an issue. I think one of the things that's really important to look at is when somebody comes in and says, well, you know what? If this cult metaphor works, we got to take the child away from the cult. Well, we have to take the child away from the alienating parent so that
Mhm.
the child can reestablish the relationship with a previously loved parent, i.e., the rejected parent. And you can get experts in court to say, this is going to be such a traumatic experience. Take that child away from that parent. That's going to be traumatizing. It's going to be draconian. I mean, I've heard every
Yeah,
description.
that's the word I hear all the time is draconian. And in fact, it's not that way at all. When you take a child out of the alienating environment, they sort of snap back into who they really are, r- kind of shockingly quickly. I mean,
Right.
I'm still sort of stunned by that when I see it.
Yeah.
But it's in other words, the attachment they have to that parent that they claim they don't want to see is still there. It's very strong. And you take away the influence of the alien. I say that alienation sort of sits on top of the attachment and sort of bears it down. But when you remove that, then they really do come around. So it's not draconian. It's not traumatic. It's Once
Well,
the child is taken out of the position of having to, because the child's been put in a position to carry the message of the alienating parent this whole time. So as soon as they're taken out of that role, because they're given a lot of authority, then they will tend to return back to their former state, unless they've been in that situation so long that now they've developed their own freestanding personality disorder, and that happens too, unfortunately.
well, Richard Warshak tells us that there's absolutely no research to support the negative effect of taking a child away from an alienating parent. There's no,
Right.
it's fallacious. It doesn't exist. Um, it's probably the most beneficial thing that can happen in many of these cases
Yeah.
uh, that allow the child to reestablish that relationship. Your point's well taken. That once you have that attachment as a young child, an infant, it that it gets I kind of describe it as being clouded over like a scab. And
Yeah.
if you could remove that child from that negative influencing environment and put them with the other, it becomes relatively quickly
It's amazing.
that they reestablish it. Well, they're free. They're free
Yeah.
to show the love and affection. They start to find out that the things that they've come to believe about that targeted parent, they're not really true.
Mhm.
They're not, that parent's not trying to poison them. They're trying,
Or starve them.
they have food, they have love and affection. They're caring for them. And so it becomes a real revelation to the child. And wait a second, I come to believe a lot of things that really don't appear to be accurate. Now, sometimes it takes a while
Yep.
because that negative influence can be very, very powerful. And
Exactly.
that the alienating parent frequently, many times, won't cooperate with the segregation. They'll sabotage it some other way. And then when the child reverts back to the rejection of the targeted parent, it becomes proof. You see, that really don't have a good relationship.
Yeah.
It's the other.
But ironically, that sort of control is evidence of that there is parental alienation. In other words, when the alienating parent, when it's to their advantage to get that child to warm up temporarily to the targeted parent, they'll do that. Because if let's say there's too much heat coming in their direction, so why don't you go see your dad or something? And there'll be things like that that accommodate, which actually is evidence that they are the puppeteer in charge of the child, which is the puppet.
Right, exactly. So again, I think we're making a case for people to be who are involved in these cases, professionals to be involved in these cases that have to have some basis knowledge of what this
Yes.
phenomenon and what the dynamics are in this case. There is a lot of misinformation that's out there about parental alienation. There's a lot of skepticism in some corners there are people that come in and testify that it doesn't even exist. Um, and which is, I mean, totally absurd to think that
Right.
you can't manipulate a child away from another parent. That seems totally absurd. But
Yes.
again, I think it's important for people to um, learn about parental alienation. There are a lot of resources out there.
Yes.
Amy Baker, Richard Warshak's books, Bill Burnett's books. Go to my website, Mike's website. You get some resources on what's out there to help.
Yes.
And this is episode 33. There are other podcasts for people to look at and get some information.
Exactly. And that's what this is all about, is really educating the people that you would expect would understand this already, but very often they don't. And
Well,
that's just
clearly the need is there.
yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, Mike, thank you for coming on. I appreciate your
My pleasure as always, Bob. It's we always have it's always a good conversation.
very good. Thank you very much.
Well, you take care. Talk to you soon then.
You too.